Who is the greatest of all time? 6 words that start more arguments than they settle. In bowling, we've got a problem. We have at least 3 legitimate answers to the GOAT question, and depending on who you ask, any one of them could be right. The internet and bowling as a whole just can't agree. Some older, more traditional players might say Earl Anthony. Stats people might say Walter Ray Williams Jr. because of his titles record, but some more modern fans might say Jason Belmonte. But much like the debate in basketball, there isn't a clear answer. So let's try to settle this once and for all. First, we'll look at the overall picture, realize it's impossibly complicated, and then build a case for each candidate one by one. By the end, you might have your own answer, or you might realize that the question itself is flawed. But before we can get into it, I'm gonna have to ask you to subscribe. I make videos like this just about every week, and we're super close to 10K, so subscribe so I can hit it before I die. Anyways, on to the video. Here's why the debate is so hard. We're trying to compare bowlers across 50 years of evolution. Different equipment, different lane conditions, different everything. The biggest issue is that all 3 candidates happened in their own eras in different levels of technology. Earl Anthony bowled in an era where equipment was primitive compared to today. Walter Ray bridged the transition from urethane to reactive resin, and Belmonte competes in the modern era with technology that Earl Anthony just simply couldn't have imagined. The tour itself has also changed. In the time where Earl Anthony competed, bowling was far more popular, and the PBA had more tournaments with bigger prize funds. By the 90s and 2000s, events were starting to slow down and get closer to where we know today, which is anywhere from 15 to 19 events per year. Lane conditions have evolved dramatically. The patterns briefly got harder, then easier, and then a lot harder again. The volumes changed, the lengths changed, and what it took to succeed in 1975 isn't what it takes to succeed in 2025. And then there's the issue of style. Earl and Walter Ray were one-handed, the way bowling had been done for nearly a century. Belmonte, on the other hand, completely revolutionized the sport by using 2 hands, fundamentally changing what's possible with rev rate and entry angle. So how do you compare them? Raw title count, titles adjusted for era, dominance relative to peers, longevity, innovation, impact? Every metric you choose changes the answer. There's no clean and crystal clear answer, but let's build each case for each one and see where it takes us. To do this, we'll start chronologically and tell the story and accolades of each one. First off, we have Earl Anthony, the first superstar. He was also the guy who made bowling legitimate as a professional sport. Earl has 43 PBA Tour titles, 6 PBA Player of the Year awards, was the first bowler to reach $1 million in career earnings, and was dominant through the 1970s into the early 80s. For a decade, Earl Anthony was the standard. When he showed up to a tournament, everyone else was bowling for second place. His approach was textbook, his mental game was unshakable, and his ability to repeat shots was legendary. This period in time was also when bowling was at peak popularity during the booms in the 1960s to 90s. Saturday afternoon on ABC, millions were watching. Earl was winning tournaments, and not just that, he was doing it in front of the biggest audiences the sport had ever had. And yet he was still beating the best of his generation. Dick Weber at the time was competitive, Mark Roth was in his prime, Marshall Holman was there with his intensity, and Earl beat them all. Now, some people will point out that Earl Anthony had the lefty advantage. Fewer lefties meant less breakdown on the left side of the lane, with more predictable ball reaction. While that might be true, you still have to execute, and Earl executed better than everyone else. As I mentioned previously, Earl has 6 Player of the Year awards, but to put that into context, most Hall of Fame bowlers either have none or just 1. Earl has 6 of them. He also fundamentally changed how bowlers presented themselves. Before Earl, bowlers looked like regular guys at the lanes. Earl dressed professionally, carried himself like an athlete, and treated bowling like a serious sport. He seriously elevated the image of professional bowling at the time. Earl had a long career, with his last title coming in 1983 when he was 45 years old. Throughout his long career, he stayed competitive in an era where the sport was changing, where early equipment was evolving, and yet, he seemingly always found a way to win. Earl tragically died in 2001 from a fall down a staircase, way too young at the age of 63. But his legacy was secure. First $1 million bowler, most dominant player in the sport's first era, and he was also the guy who defined what it meant to be the greatest of all time. So what's his perception today? Traditionalists revere him. He's the baseline for greatness in bowling. If you won as much as Earl, you're a legend. If you dominated your era like Earl, you're GOAT. But younger fans never saw him bowl, and sometimes they dismiss him because equipment was primitive or because he had a lefty advantage. And I admit, this is a category that I sometimes find myself in, because there's a lot to consider. Is the modern game actually harder or actually easier? Because you can say yes or no, but the answer isn't right in front of you. You can't have a yes or no to this. In the 70s, the tour typically had 30 plus events per year. Today, it's about half of that. So raw title count across eras gets complicated. But here's the thing, Earl won almost everything there was to win in his era. He beat everyone who mattered. He did it on TV when the stakes were highest, and he did it longer than almost everyone else. That is the case for Earl. Moving on to the second player, and one that is commonly regarded as the greatest of all time, with Earl right behind him. Our next subject is none other than Walter Ray Williams Jr. He is the most decorated PBA bowler by the numbers. 47 PBA Tour titles, 7 Player of the Year awards, 8 major championships, over $4.9 million in career earnings. The all-time leader in titles, tied all-time for Player of the Year awards with Belmo, and just about every other stat you can name, he had his name on. Walter Ray's career stood 4 decades of top-level competition. He won his first PBA Tour title back in 1986, and he won his last one in 2010 at the USBC Masters. That's a total of 24 years between his first and last titles. That longevity is almost superhuman. Walter Ray's prime came in the 90s and 2000s when the tour had fewer events but deeper fields. The competition was fierce, the conditions were often brutal, but Walter Ray Williams Jr. kept winning anyway. 8 majors. These aren't easy tournaments. These are the ones where the best show up, and the conditions are simply unforgiving. While Walter Ray has the stats, certainly, his form is not textbook by any means. It has been said before that if coaches were shown Walter Ray's form, they would try to change just about everything about it. And for some, this might ding his credibility significantly. Regardless, his longevity is even more impressive when you realize the changes he went through the sport. He started in the urethane era, then adapted to reactive resin, and survived the transition to fewer tour stops. He even kept winning as younger players with more power came along. In the 2000s, Walter Ray was in his 40s and 50s, competing against players in their 20s and 30s. He didn't have the physical advantage anymore. Guys were throwing their balls harder, generating more rev rate, playing steeper angles. Walter Ray just kept executing, making spares, and finding ways to win. One simply does not come across 7 Player of the Year awards. That's also one more than Earl Anthony. That's the most in PBA history, tied with Belmo. And they came across multiple decades, which shows his longevity further. So what's his perception today? Walter is often looked upon with overwhelming respect. Everyone acknowledges that Walter Ray has the numbers. 47 titles, 7 Player of the Year awards, 8 majors, you can't argue with that resume. But some people say he's not the GOAT, because he wasn't as dominant as Earl was in his prime. Others say it was the equipment that made it easier to score. And now there's a new generation saying that Belmo has or is going to pass him in about everything that matters. The argument for Walter is simple. He has more of everything than anyone else. More titles, more Player of the Year awards, the longest prime in the sport's history. If greatness is about sustained excellence, Walter Ray is the answer. Now, whether or not he's the GOAT, Walter Ray Williams Jr. certainly set standards that might never be reached again. 47 titles in the modern era, competing at the highest level for decades, that's Walter Ray. Now to the final candidate, the most controversial, Jason Belmonte, the newest guy on the block and still active today. 32 PBA Tour titles and counting, 7 Player of the Year awards, 15 major championships, the most in PBA history, multiple perfect games on TV, and started the two-handed revolution. Now let's break all these down. Because what Belmo did to bowling, pretty much nobody else did. He fundamentally changed what's possible. His rev rate is just off the charts compared to the more traditional one-handers that were back in the 60s and 70s. And everything today is just so incredibly different that it is almost impossible to compare him to anyone else. He is certainly one of a kind. But walk into any center you see today, and you'll see kids throwing two-handed. That's Belmo's influence. He proved that the style worked at the highest level, and now an entire generation is following after him. That's the cultural impact, so large you can't even measure it. But the best part about his career wasn't the style or the just regular amount of titles, because let's be honest, 32 is not really anything too special. 15 major championships. Nearly half of all of his titles are major championships. That's 5 more than anyone else in PBA history. From around 2013 to 2022, Belmo was as dominant as anyone's ever been in bowling. 7 Player of the Year awards, he was beating the best players in the world on the toughest patterns and making it look routine, just like the others. But here's where things start to get complicated. Some traditionalists argue that two-handed bowling is easier, that the extra revs and steeper angle make it more forgiving. There's some truth to that argument. Two-handed, after all, can generate more revs. The entry angle can be steeper, which can be advantageous on modern patterns. But easier? Not necessarily. Belmo still has to hit his mark, he still has to make spares, and he still has to perform under pressure, just like everybody else. And that argument that his style gives him an unfair advantage quickly falls apart when you see him dominating other two-handers who have the same advantages. So what's Belmo's perception in the PBA and bowling as a whole? It's relatively divided. Modern fans and younger bowlers see him as the clear GOAT. 15 majors, that's 33% higher than the next bowler on the list. 7 Player of the Year awards, tied with the former GOAT. Revolutionary impact on the sport. The numbers are clearly there. But those traditionalists push back hard. They say that two-handed bowling isn't real bowling, and I've seen this a lot. They say he's exploiting a loophole, that his success is more about his style than it is skill. And a lot of it is just sheer resistance to change. People don't like change after all. But the scariest part for his competition and his legacy is that he's clearly not done. Belmo is in his early 40s and still making stepladders consistently. He could easily add another 5 to 10 titles if he gets enough luck. He could easily get to 20 majors with enough luck as well. He could possibly win another Player of the Year award and surpass Walter Ray. If this happens, would he be the GOAT? So that's the case of Belmonte. He dominated his era as thoroughly as anyone else. He revolutionized the sport in a way that Earl and Ray didn't, and he's still adding to his resume. So people just turn to the lame excuse of blaming the era. So who's the GOAT? After all of that explanation, we still don't have a clear answer. Because the truth is, they're all the GOAT, just in different ways. Earl Anthony was the GOAT of his era. He dominated when bowling was at its absolute peak as a mainstream sport. He won on the biggest stages in front of the biggest audiences. He set the standard for what it meant to be a professional bowler. Walter Ray is the GOAT of sustained excellence. Nobody stayed elite longer, nobody won more, and his resume is probably the most complete out of anyone in the sport's history. If you're building the all-time team based on purely accomplishments and statistics, Walter Ray is probably the first pick. Jason Belmonte is the GOAT of impact and innovation. He changed bowling forever. He has the most majors ever. He completely dominated that era of early two-handers, and he's still going. If his career ended today, he'd be in the conversation, sure, but by the time he actually retires, the resume might be undeniable. But the reason this debate even exists in the first place is because bowling has changed so drastically across these 3 careers. all the equipment, the conditions, the competition, the economics behind everything. You can try to adjust for era. And this is where I reveal something. I did just that. While making this video, I got curious about what the value of everyone's titles would be if you adjusted for inflation. Because, like I've stated in multiple videos, there were more events back then, therefore more titles. So I created a formula for what I'm calling raw titles, or how much a title is worth after you take out the inflation. I came to this number based on the amount of events that were held in that year, so like for example 1986 is Walter's first season, compared to the 2019 season, with majors valued at 50% more, because after all, you're bowling more games, more competition, higher prize money, WSOB, all of that, World Championships, they matter the most. So overall, what did I find? Jason Belmonte's titles were worth significantly more than Earl's. But considering those tournaments in that era were slightly longer upon average, I would say that Earl is probably closer to Walter. But with that being said, this is where Walter is. And this is Belmo. By adjusted title count alone, Jason Belmonte is the greatest of all time. But this is the very reason why this debate never ends. Because depending on what you value, any of those three could be the answer. If you value peak, Earl's your guy. If you want longevity and total accomplishments, it's Walter Ray. If you value the majors the most, it's Belmo. We haven't even talked about the other legitimate candidates. Pete Weber's 10 majors, Norm Duke's 40 titles, and EJ Tackett's recent dominance. The debate gets even more complicated when you widen the field. But these three stand out far beyond everyone else in PBA history. But the issue is, these three are oddly close, and that's a huge issue. This debate is going to keep evolving. Someday, some young two-handed bowler, maybe even a one-hander, who's still in high school right now, might come along and win 50 titles and 20 majors and make this whole conversation obsolete in 10 years. That's just how the sport works. So to review for a final time, Earl Anthony dominated his era, he had the most peak. Walter Ray had the most stats. Jason had the most majors and his revolution with his cultural impact. They're all the GOAT. They're legitimate answers to an impossible question. And maybe that's the real answer. Maybe bowling is lucky enough to have three different GOATs from three different eras who all change the sport in their own ways. The debate will continue. Belmo will keep adding to his resume. Some rising star, EJ Tackett, will emerge and complicate everything further. And bowling fans will keep arguing about it online. But if you force me to pick one, well, that's a different video. And you probably would disagree with me anyway. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching all the way through the end. I put a lot of effort into these videos, especially the scripting process for this one was some of the most fun I've ever had writing a script. Doing all the math took a little bit, but it was worth it in the end. Once again, hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more. I'm going to be hopefully releasing some merch at 10K, and I'll keep you guys updated as I go along. But that's about all I've got time for today, so hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.